She was born in a thunderstorm. I don't know if that's true, but somebody once wrote that about her, and it seems to fit. She swirled into and out of my life, quickly changing everything, a dark question mark disappearing into a darker hole. Her name was Anna Kane. It's supposed to be coin, she once told me, in maybe the second conversation I had with her, and there's a couple of theories of how it got to be spelled with an A. One is that some of the family was involved in some sort of criminal activity a long time ago, hundreds of years, murder, kidnapping, that sort of thing, and that the more respectable relatives changed the spelling of their name to distance themselves from the bad ones. Another version has it that it was the criminals who changed their name to Kane so that it would be harder to find them once they had left their old lives behind. I told her that I heard the same thing about my family, since my last name was also available in an O and an A version. You'd think if they really wanted to distance themselves from each other, they'd change more than just one letter, I said. Well, it's a bit mysterious, she said, maybe a little put off by the fact that her story wasn't as unique as she thought. She and her parents had moved into town, which in itself was an odd occurrence, since not too many people moved into town, they almost all moved out. But there were the Kanes, watching the movers unload the truck and put their boxed belongings in the white two-story, three-bedroom house on Twixt Road, just before it intersected with Town Street, which ran down by the river. The neighbors watched too, slowly pulled out of their houses and down the street, attracted to the yellow moving truck as if it were a huge magnet. They came by and introduced themselves and stood with the Kanes like spectators at a parade, a ball game, or some great historical event worthy of a rapt, attentive crowd. My friend Carl Hawthorne and I rode our bikes over and stood with the large group that had formed. We didn't really care about the truck or what came out of it. We didn't really care about the parents and what they looked like. We'd already heard that the Kanes had an only child, a girl our age. We wanted to see the girl. We were disappointed. She was not what we had expected and far from what we had hoped for. She came out of the house wearing a pair of headphones over her short, straight blonde hair, the cord snaked in the pocket of a short black jacket. It was the kind of jacket someone would pump gas in, worn on a hot, humid day when it was, with complete certainty, the only jacket being worn in town. Under the jacket she had a black shirt, which, I found out later, was long sleeved. She never wore short sleeves. She was also wearing a pair of jeans and heavy boots, black. She wore the thick eyeliner and a black expression. She sat down in the grass and started writing in a black notebook. I didn't give her much thought that day, but once I got to know her I often wondered whether she had been completely different the day before we first saw her, whether she had dressed in normal clothes with a more inviting appearance and expression. Except for two notable exceptions, I never witnessed any other incarnation. She was always in her goth gear, black and blonde and brooding. It's a freak show, Carl said. Let's go back to your house. I lived about a mile and a half north of the Kanes, in a house that was very similar to theirs. We lived on Valley View Road, but you couldn't see a valley from it. We were actually at the bottom of a hill, where we only saw hills in all directions. It was a long walk to the Kanes if you stayed on the streets, but you could save some time if you cut through Mrs. Owen's yard and then across the vacant lot where the Booth house had burned down 2 years before. Then, when you got to Tallis Road, you cut through the Bordens. You could get there in about 15 minutes. I would do it lots of times. All of this would become important. Her given name was Anna, but she insisted on being called Anastasia. We had that in common. I wanted everyone to use my first full name. It wasn't out of vanity. I was named after my mother's brother, who had died young, just 13, and I'd always been called by the full name because he had been. I never liked my name much. It never really seemed mine, a sort of hand-me-down from someone who never got enough use out of it. But what can you do? Only famous people have their names changed, or else somebody has to give you a nickname, and no one was going to do that for me. Or you had to be someone like Anna and just take the name for yourself. I love your name, Anna said. It's almost a perfect double-dactyl. A what? Higgledy-piggledy. That's a perfect double-dactyl. Two three-syllable words with the stresses on the first two syllables. Your first name and your last name have the same number of syllables, almost the same sounds. They mirror each other, or are parallel or parallaxed or something. Okay. I was ready to be done with it. If she hadn't said higgledy-piggledy, I might have told her about my dead uncle and how he had died under strange circumstances. Maybe she was onto something. Maybe there was a connection between the two of us. Maybe he was parallel, although we shared only the same first name. We could have gone into all that, but I didn't really want to continue with any conversation where higgledy-piggledy was used, and especially when I was being compared with it. You should pay attention to things like that. It's your name. You'll always have that. It means something. The mirror thing's worth thinking about. Or is it repetition? It's a double nature, anyway. The first and then the next being the same. Maybe you had a twin you didn't know about. Maybe there's a ghost following you around. Or maybe it has something to do with parallel lines. You know, they meet at infinity. That's interesting. But maybe it has nothing to do with you. I don't know you well enough to figure it out yet. Okay, what about your name? What does it mean? You'll have to figure that out for yourself. She was always spooky. Her friends were worse. They strolled silently through the school in their funeral clothes and black lipstick and eyeliner and gun black hair. There were 7 Marilyn Manson types in school, one for every day of the week, Carl had said, as if one wasn't enough. 3 of them in our sophomore class. There were 2 seniors and 2 juniors and no freshmen. We hoped they were a species headed for extinction. They stuck out like badly bruised thumbs, and we thought they were pretentious and full of shit. They were rarely alone, a traveling convention of mourners, except for her. I would see her sitting off by herself in class, eating alone in the cafeteria, or just standing on her own in the hallway between classes. It's what I disliked most about her at first. I thought she was even more pretentious and bolder than her friends, and then it became one of the things I liked most about her. Sometimes it works out that way, I guess, and sometimes the other way. Our school, good old Hamilton High, was 3 stories tall, long rectangle situated east-west on top of a low hill, with an entrance on each of the shorter sides. There's some debate about whom the school is named after. Almost everyone assumed it was named after the adulterous Alexander Hamilton, as Anna liked to call him, who was shot dead by Aaron Burr in a duel on the banks of the Hudson River for spreading lies and rumors about Burr. There had been Hamiltons around town years ago, but no one had ever found anything they had done to be noteworthy or exceptional enough to name a building after any of them. But there were people who still believed the school was named after some of those other Hamiltons. My mother was one of those people. She contended that the town would never name a building, especially a school, after such an immoral man. "He's on the $10 bill, Mom," I said. "What the federal government decides is suitable has nothing to do with us," she said. It was the most political statement I ever heard my mother make. Everybody stood around the hallways before class, and every group had his own spot. The bandoids were always in the basement, the arty types hung around Mr. Divins' room. The jocks were on the first floor by the west entrance, down the hall from the 4-H'ers. The geeks hung out at the eastern end of the second floor. The speech and debate team was on the western end. "I don't do a lot of business on the second floor," Carl always said. Carl traveled from floor to floor, and it never mattered where I was. Anna and the rest of the ghouls were always on the third floor, a dark cloud hanging there. Sometimes walking to school I would look up and see them, crow black and still, perched high in the morning sky. And after school they walked together into the nearby woods. They were said to do all sorts of things there. They took drugs and had sex and performed rituals involving animal sacrifices. They cast spells there, placing curses on people in town, and plotted whom to torment and inflict pain and suffering on. Some people in school avoided the woods, but I never had a problem. Carl and I had come across trees with strange markings cut into them, and a circle of upside-down crosses, but we never knew whether those things had been left by the goths themselves or somebody else trying to add to their reputation. It all seemed so silly, but what was more idiotic? A group of high schoolers standing around chanting a bunch of mumbo-jumbo, or the rest of the school thinking this type of stuff actually happened, and then it might really work. There were tons of rumors about them. They were burnouts and vegans. They'd pierced their bodies in strange places and had tattoos of runes and symbols in foreign languages all over. They were Satan worshippers, witches. They performed strange occult rituals involving decapitating animals and drinking blood. There were rumors that the guys in the group had taken the girls as their wives, and that they all shared them with one another. They engaged in bondage and torture and self-mutilation. They had sex with corpses. They were all gay. If you believed everything, they were tattooed, Satan-worshipping, goth-Mormon, homosexual, S&M piercing, necrophiliac, drug-using vegetarians. It was a small school, and they must have known what was being said about them all the time behind their black backs, but they never responded. They were mysterious and odd, and no one liked them. I would have gone on ignoring Anna Kane forever, except for the fact that she spoke to me first. If I had known that she was coming my way, I would have done everything in my power to avoid her. She wasn't the person you wanted to be seen with. She wasn't someone you thought would talk to you first, either. She sneaked up on me. It was the end of September, and I was in the library stacks, wasting the rest of my lunch hour, trying out a new theory, a suggestion one of my teachers had given me. I had taken On the Road by Jack Kerouac from the shelf and turned around, and there she was, standing quietly a few feet away, calmly staring at me. "Burroughs is better," she said. I don't know about that. I looked at the book in my hand, and then looked past her. It should have indicated to her that I wanted to get by to check out the Kerouac. She didn't pay any attention. She stood her ground and gave me a slight smile. She had more to tell me. "He shot his wife, you know." "I know," I said. I didn't know. I didn't even know whether she was talking about Burroughs or Kerouac. I was just hoping that she would stop talking and let me get away from her as quickly as possible. They were playing William Tell. They were drinking in a friend's apartment, and Burroughs pulls out a gun and turns on his wife and says, "It's time for the old William Tell act," and she puts a glass on her head, and then he shoots her. "Really?" I said. And she told me the whole story about William Burroughs and how he was the grandson of the inventor of the adding machine, and how he was friends with Kerouac and is in On the Road as Old Bully and his wife is Jane, and how Even killing his wife didn't do anything to curb his fascination with guns, and that he used to make paintings with cans of paint and a shotgun. The words streamed out of her. She could have been making it up, for all I knew, but I actually wanted to hear more. Did he go to prison? It happened in Mexico, she said, as if that was all the explanation I needed. There was an awkward pause. I wanted her to continue, but she had finished. I panicked and said, "I suppose you're looking for Stephen King," and moved on to let her go around me and deeper into the stacks. She looked at me as if I were an idiot. I could feel an embarrassed blush fill my face, and I was afraid that she might turn and leave. A couple of minutes before, I had wanted desperately to get away from her, and now I was hoping that she would stay and pay more attention to me. She stayed. "He's only written 2 books worth reading," she said. There wasn't a pause, but a full stop, and I stood waiting for her to speak. If I hadn't asked her to name the book, she never would have divulged her opinion. She had an intriguing way of speaking. Her sentences were icebergs, with just the tip of her thought coming out of her mouth, and the rest kept up in her head, which I was starting to think was more and more beautiful the longer I looked at her. "Carrie and The Shining," she finally said. "I've read The Shining," I said, happy to have something in common. "One to go," she said, "and then you can be done with Mr. King." She was looking for H.P. Lovecraft, whom I had never heard of. He wrote horror stories, she said, in the early 1900s. She read anything, but she especially liked books, fiction and non-fiction, about the supernatural. She continued to move through the stacks, and I followed her. She was done talking, so I watched her scan the rows and rows of books, selecting authors and titles I probably would have never heard of, like Yukio Mishima, James Baldwin, and all the little live things, until she had an armful. I went to the front desk and checked out both the Kerouac and the King, while she simply walked out with hers and waited for me by the door. "I'll return them when I'm finished," she said. I had the feeling that she did that sort of thing all the time. The rules didn't apply. I had to get to class, but I wanted to keep following her. I wanted her to talk to me more. By the time I had thought of saying something else to her, she was disappearing down the hall.